A trail of dust followed her for the last mile, ghost pale in the late afternoon sun, and by the time Sarah Whitcomb reached the gate of the Teller Ranch, her throat was too parched to manage more than a whisper. "I'm looking for work," she said to the tall, sun-browned man who came out from the barn at the sound of the gate latch, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Any kind. Cooking, mending, laundry, milking. I'll do whatever needs doing, Mr. Teller, if you'll have me." Amos Teller looked at her for a long moment without answering, the way he looked at weather he didn't yet trust, and Sarah understood, standing there swaying slightly on feet that had carried her 12 miles through drought-cracked country since sunup, that she must look a fright. Her hem grey with dust, her bonnet askew, her hands trembling faintly at her sides from hunger and heat both. She had left what remained of her and Daniel's claim 2 days back, after the last of the flour ran out and the well went dry entire, walked the first stretch to dry Mesa Township, and then, hearing there in the mercantile that the Teller place was short-handed and desperate enough to take on anyone willing, walked the remaining distance out here on nothing but that thin rumour and the last of her nerve. "You've walked from town," Amos said. It was not quite a question. "Farther than town," she admitted. "From the old Whitcomb claim out past the wash. My husband passed this spring. The land wasn't worth keeping after, not without him to work it. And the bank's already got its notice nailed to what's left of the door." She heard her own voice shake on the last of it, and hated the shaking, because she had promised herself on the long walk that she would not arrive here sounding like a woman asking for pity. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Teller. I'm asking for work. I can prove myself if you'll let me." He was quiet again, turning the rag over in his hands, and Sarah braced herself for the answer she had already heard twice that week from other ranches near a town. That a woman alone was more trouble than help, that a bachelor's outfit was no fit place for an unmarried widow, that he was sorry for her circumstances but couldn't take on the risk to either of their reputations. She had the refusal half absorbed already, the way a body braces before a blow it knows is coming. "You'll stay," Amos said instead. Sarah blinked. "I beg your pardon? You'll stay?" he said again, as though the words cost him some effort to spend twice. "I lost my last 2 hands a month back to the drought. Went looking for wetter country and better wages both, and I don't blame them for it. I've got 60 head of cattle, a house that needs a woman's hand worse than it'll admit, and no time left in the day to do the cooking myself on top of everything else that's dying of thirst out here. You want work, I've got more of it than I can manage alone. Whatever the town says about the propriety of it, they can say to my face. I've got a bunkhouse standing empty and a housekeeper's room off the kitchen that's sat unused 2 years. You'll have your own door and your own lock, and I'll not trouble you beyond what the work requires." It was, Sarah thought, the longest speech she had ever heard a stranger deliver, and it earned something in her chest that she had been holding rigid since Daniel's funeral. She had expected at best a night's charity and a polite refusal come morning. She had not expected a man's whole ranch handed over to trust inside of 5 minutes, offered as plainly as he might offer a stray dog a bowl of water. "Thank you," she managed. "I won't give you cause to regret it." "I don't doubt that," Amos said, and turned back toward the barn before she could see whatever expression had crossed his weathered face at the sight of her standing there, dust-caked and trembling and entirely too proud to let either show more than she could help. "There's water in the kitchen barrel, what's left of it. Drink first. Everything else can wait." Amos had not meant to take in a stranger off the road. He had meant, that morning, only to ride the fence line and see how much more of it the drought had loosened before the whole west pasture came apart entire. But there was something in the set of the woman's shoulders as she stood at his gate. Something that put him in mind of his own mother in the last hard year before the fever took her and his father both, leaving Amos, at 19, the whole of the Teller place to run alone, the particular straight-backed exhaustion of someone who has decided, against every reasonable expectation, not to fall down. He had watched his mother hold that same posture through a winter that should have broken her, and he had learned, watching it, that a person who looked that close to falling was very often the last one who actually would. He did not examine, that first evening, why the sight of her had loosened something in his chest that had been locked tight for the better part of 6 years, Not since his younger sister Ruth had married and moved on to Cheyenne and left him the last teller standing on land that once held a whole noisy family. He told himself only that he needed the help, badly, with the drought worse than any he'd seen in 15 years working this ground, and that a woman desperate enough to walk 12 miles through dust for a stranger's charity was very likely a woman desperate enough to work hard for it after. He was right about that, at least. Within a week, Sarah Whitcomb had the house cleaner than it had been since his mother's day, had found a way to stretch the dwindling flour and beans into meals that actually filled a working man's belly, and had proven more than once that her hands were as capable with a milk pail or a mending needle as any he'd ever hired. She did not complain of the heat, though it was brutal that summer, nor of the long hours, though they stretched longer each week as the drought tightened its grip on the whole basin. She simply worked, steady and uncomplaining, and watched him sometimes across the supper table with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not pity, he didn't think, though he half expected pity, given the scar the drought was carving into his own face with worry these days. Something gentler than pity, something that looked almost like understanding. The drought was the worst Amos had seen since he was a boy, and it showed no sign of breaking. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of his land, Cottonwood Creek, thin and silver even in good years, but reliable, the one water source on his whole spread that hadn't yet gone to cracked mud, was down to half its usual flow by the time Sarah had been at the ranch a month, and every rancher in the basin knew it. Because every rancher in the basin was watching his own water dry up and eyeing his neighbors with the particular hunger of men who understood that in a drought year, water was worth more than gold and considerably harder to come by honestly. Bartholomew Grissom understood it best of all. He owned the largest spread in the basin, 3 times the size of a most modest holding, and he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to buy the teller place outright, offering sums that would have tempted a less stubborn man and being refused each time with the same flat, unyielding word Amos gave to most things he'd already decided about. Grissom's interest was in Cottonwood Creek itself, the water rights attached to Amos' land, which controlled the flow to 3 smaller operations downstream besides his own, and the worse the drought grew, the more openly Grissom's interest curdled into something closer to threat. He rode out to the teller place himself on a scorching afternoon in late July, trailed by 2 of his hired men, and found Sarah in the yard hauling wash water from what remained of the well, her sleeves rolled and her face flushed with the heat and the effort both. Grissom did not dismount. He rarely troubled himself to dismount for anyone he considered beneath his notice, and it was plain from the slow, assessing way his eyes moved over her that he had already decided Sarah Whitcomb belonged in that category. "You'd be the widow teller's taken in," he said. Bold of him, given how the town's been talking. Bolder of you, given you've got no husband left to protect what's left of your reputation. "I've got work to do, Mr. Grissom," Sarah said, setting down her bucket but not backing away from the shadow his horse cast over her. "If your business is with Mr. Teller, he's out mending fence on the north section. My business is with the both of you," in a manner of speaking, Grissom said, and smiled the particular smile of a man accustomed to getting his way through patience rather than force, because force had rarely proven necessary. "I've made Teller a fair offer for this land 3 times now, each one better than the last, and each time he's turned me down out of nothing but stubborn pride. Now there's a drought on that's like to ruin every small operation in this basin before it breaks. And I'd think a woman in your position, widowed, penniless, dependent on a bachelor's charity for the roof over your head, might have some influence in convincing him that pride doesn't put water in a dry well. I'd make it worth your while to try." Sarah felt her spine go rigid with an anger that steadied rather than shook her. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Grissom, and neither is my influence, if I've got any at all, which I doubt. Mr. Teller makes his own decisions about his own land. I'd thank you to ride on and let him make them without an audience." Grissom's smile thinned, the way a man's smile does when a plan meets resistance he hadn't accounted for. "You're loyal to a man who's known you a month. That's either admirable or foolish, Mrs. Whitcomb, and time generally proves which." He touched his hat, brief and mocking, and turned his horse without further word, his 2 hired men falling in behind him as they rode back toward the road. Sarah told Amos about it that evening, over a supper thinner than either of them liked to admit the drought had made it. Amos listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening by degrees as she spoke, and when she finished he set down his fork with a care that told her the anger underneath was larger than the gesture let show. "He's tried that trick before," Amos said. "Not with you, with old Hutchins, who used to run the spread 2 sections over, before Grissom squeezed him dry enough to sell cheap. Grissom doesn't fight fair when he thinks fighting dirty will cost him less. I should have warned you he might come sniffing around once he heard I'd taken on help. I can handle Bartholomew Grissom," Sarah said. "I've handled worse men with less warning." Something in the way she said it, flat and sure, made Amos look her more closely than he generally allowed himself to. "Your husband, no," Sarah said. "Daniel was gentle, whatever else our marriage lacked. It was my husband's father who taught me how to stand up to a man who thinks a widow's got no teeth left to bite with. He tried to claim half our land after Daniel died, arguing some old family right that didn't exist outside his own wanting. I fought him in the county office for 3 weeks before he gave it up. I've got more teeth than most men expect, Mr. Teller. It generally surprises them." Amos found himself unexpectedly smiling, a rare enough occurrence that Sarah noticed it immediately, and found she liked the sight of it considerably more than she'd expected to. "It doesn't surprise me," he said. "Not anymore." The gossip in Dry Mesa grew louder as the summer wore on, exactly as Grissom had predicted it would, though Sarah suspected, rightly, though she never had the proof of it outright, that Grissom's own wife and her circle of friends did a fair amount to fan whatever flame Grissom had first struck. Mrs. Ottilie Petty, who ran the mercantile with her husband and considered herself the moral compass of the whole township, took to remarking within Sarah's hearing, whenever she came into town for supplies, that a respectable widow ought to know better than to live unchaperoned under a bachelor's roof, whatever hardship had driven her to it, and that Amos Teller's reputation would suffer for the arrangement even if his intentions proved entirely honorable. Sarah bore it the way she had learned to bear most cruelties since Daniel's death, with her chin level and her purchases counted out in exact change, refusing the gossips the satisfaction of a visible wound. One July afternoon, though, Mrs. Petty pressed further than usual, catching Sarah's sleeve as she turned to leave the mercantile counter. "I only say it out of concern for your soul, Mrs. Whitcomb. A widow living alone under a bachelor's roof, however desperate her circumstances. Folks talk, and talk has a way of following a woman long after the circumstances that caused it are forgotten. Mr. Teller offered me honest work when no one else in this basin would," Sarah said, turning to face her fully, her voice steady though her pulse was not. "I've scrubbed his floors, mended his shirts, and kept his accounts straight through the worst drought this basin has seen in 15 years, same as any hired hand would, and I've done it with my own door locked every night, same as any decent arrangement requires. If you'd like to concern yourself with my soul, Mrs. Petty, I'd suggest concerning yourself instead with whether gossip about a starving widow's desperation reflects better on my character, or on the character of a town that let her walk 12 miles for want of any other offer of help." She did not wait for a reply, only nodded once, polite and final, and walked out into the dusty street with her purchases in hand and her spine very straight. But it cost her something each time, a small toll levied against a pride already worn thin by a summer of relentless, back-breaking work, and by August she had begun to wonder, in the private hours before sleep, whether her presence at the Teller Ranch was doing Amos more harm than the help she offered was worth. She raised the question with him one evening on the porch, the two of them watching heat lightning flicker without rain along the western ridge, a common enough torment that summer, the sky promising relief it never delivered. "I could take a room in town," she said, "find other work. I don't want my staying here to cost you standing in the basin, Amos, not on top of everything else Grissom's already trying to take from you." "You'd rather leave than let the town talk?" Amos asked, and there was something rawer in his voice than she'd heard from him before, something that made her look at him properly in the dim light. "I'd rather not be the reason a decent man loses ground to a man like Grissom," she said. "That's different from wanting to leave." Amos was quiet a long moment, the lightning flickering silent and dry along the ridge. "My sister Ruth used to tell me I'd let this ranch turn me into a hermit," he said finally. "Said I'd rather talk to cattle than people, and she wasn't far wrong most years. I got used to being alone after our folks died. Got used to it the way a man gets used to a boot that doesn't quite fit, telling himself the ache is just how boots feel. Then you walked up my drive covered in dust and asked for work, and it's the first time in longer than I care to say that this house has felt like it had a person in it instead of just a man waiting out his days. He turned to look at her fully. I don't care what Mrs. Petty says in the Mercantile. I care whether you want to stay. That's the only vote that carries any weight with me. I want to stay, Sarah'd, quiet but certain, and something eased in both of them at the saying of it, though neither reached for the other's hand that night, both still too new to whatever this was becoming to trust it with more than words. In the weeks that followed, the two of them fell into a rhythm that felt, to Sarah's quiet surprise, less like the arrangement of employer and hired help and more like the steady partnership of two people building something together. She rode out with him some mornings to check the herd, learning the names he'd given each of his best cows, laughing, a real laugh, the first she'd managed since Daniel's death, when a stubborn heifer refused 3 times running to be driven back toward the thinning grass near the creek. Amos, for his part, began leaving small kindnesses in his wake that he never remarked on directly. A jar of wildflowers, wilted fast in the heat but gathered all the same, left on the kitchen table some mornings, the porch step he fixed without being asked. Once he noticed it catching the hem of her skirt. The extra hour he spent teaching her to shoot a rifle straight for snakes, he claimed, though both of them understood it was Grissom's men he was thinking of. Neither spoke yet of what was growing between them, but it grew regardless, steady as the creek had once run, before the drought and before Grissom's greed threatened to choke it entirely. The drought broke the town's patience before it broke the sky. By late August, 3 of the smaller operations downstream from Cottonwood Creek had failed outright, their owners selling out cheap to the only buyer with ready cash in the basin, and Grissom's holdings swelled accordingly while the water in the creek kept dropping. Amos rationed what remained with a careful hand, sharing what little surplus he could spare with the 2 families still holding on downstream, a generosity Sarah noted and quietly admired, because it was exactly the kind of decency that would never once occur to a man like Grissom to extend. It was Jubal Hicks, an old hand who'd worked the teller place decades back under Amos's father and had ridden out from town one afternoon to see how the ranch was faring, who brought the warning that changed everything. Grissom's men have been surveying up past your north fence line, Jubal said, sitting his horse in the yard with the particular grimness of a man delivering news he didn't have to. Talking about diverting cottonwood upstream of your land entire, digging a channel to run more of the flow onto Grissom's own section before it ever reaches you. There's no law says a man can't dig on his own ground, and the water rights on paper are murky enough upstream that Grissom thinks he can argue his way clear if anyone challenges him after the fact. By the time the county sorts out whose water it rightly was, your creek could run dry a full season, maybe more. He means to starve you into selling, Amos, same as he did Hutchins, only faster. Amos's face went hard and still in a way Sarah had not seen from him, and she understood, watching it, exactly how much restraint he'd been exercising all summer in the name of decency, and exactly how close that restraint now stood to breaking. He asked, "Tonight, my source in town tells me, Grissom means to have the channel dug and the water running his way before anyone's got time to file a legal complaint against it. Figures a thing already done is harder to undo than a thing merely threatened." Sarah stepped forward before Amos could speak again. "Then we stop him before it's done. This isn't your fight," Amos said, though there was no real conviction in the words, only the habit of a man used to shielding others from his own troubles. "Became my fight the day you told me I'd stay," Sarah said. "This ranch feeds me same as it feeds you, Amos tell her, and I'll not stand in the kitchen wringing my hands while a man like Grissom steals the water out from under both our futures. Tell me what needs doing." They rode out together after dark, Amos, Sarah, and Jubal, following the fence line north by moonlight toward the stretch of Cottonwood Creek that ran closest to the disputed boundary. The night was hot and starlit, heat lightning still flickering uselessly along the western ridge, and Sarah's heart hammered with a fear she refused to let slow her horse, because she had learned in the hardest year of her life that fear was a poor excuse for standing still when standing still cost more than moving did. They found Grissom's men exactly where Jubal had warned they'd be, 4 hired hands with shovels and a small dynamite charge, already 3 hours into cutting a channel that would bleed Cottonwood Creek away from Teller land and onto Grissom's own before dawn. Grissom himself sat his horse at the edge of the work, overseeing with the same unhurried patience he'd shown in Amos's yard weeks before, plainly confident that no one would arrive in time to stop what was already half finished. "Teller," Grissom said, unsurprised, when Amos rode into the lantern light with Sarah and Jubal flanking him. "I did wonder if word would reach you before morning. No matter now. This channel's on my own land, dug with my own hands and my own dynamite, and there's no law in this territory that says a man can't move water across ground he owns outright. The water rights on this creek were surveyed and recorded 30 years back by my father," Amos said, his voice low and hard in a way Sarah had never heard from him. "You know that, Grissom, same as every rancher in this basin knows it. You're not moving water across your own ground. You're stealing water off mine and 3 other families besides, and dressing the theft up in enough legal fog to slow down a challenge till the damage is already done. Prove it in county court, if you've got the money and the months to spare for the fight," Grissom said. "By the time you do, this channel will have run a season, maybe 2, and your creek will be nothing but cracked mud, same as Hutchins's was before he saw sense and sold. I'd have thought a practical man would see the wisdom in accepting my offer now, before there's nothing left worth negotiating over." It was then that the sky, which had promised rain all summer and delivered nothing but heat, lightning and dust, finally made good on a threat of an entirely different kind. A spark from one of the hired men's lanterns, knocked loose in the scuffle of positioning the dynamite charge, caught in the dry grass at the channel's edge, and within seconds a line of fire was racing along the parched ground toward the very dynamite meant to finish Grissom's theft. Fire that would, if it reached the charge, turn a water dispute to something considerably more deadly for every soul standing near it. "The charge," Jubal shouted, and for one frozen instant every man present simply stared at the flame licking hungrily toward the packed dynamite, too startled by the sudden danger to move. It was Sarah who moved first. She had grown up on a claim where prairie fire was an ever-present terror, had beaten out grass fires with wet sacking beside her own mother before she was 10 years old, and her body understood the danger before her mind had finished forming the thought. She swung down from her horse, tore the saddle blanket free, and threw herself toward the spreading flame, beating at it with the heavy wool with a strength born entirely of necessity, shouting for the others to do the same even as she worked. Amos was beside her in an instant, his own coat off and beating the fire from the other flank, and Jubal close behind, even 2 of Grissom's own hired men abandoning their employer's scheme to join the fight once the danger to their own lives became plain. Because whatever a man was willing to do for wages, precious few were willing to burn alive for them. Grissom himself sat frozen on his horse for several long seconds, and Sarah, glancing up once through smoke and effort, saw on his face for the first time all summer something other than smug confidence, raw, unguarded fear. They beat the fire back in the space of perhaps 4 terrible minutes, though it felt considerably longer, smothering the last licking flames scarcely 10 feet from where the dynamite charge sat waiting. When it was finally out, the night gone silent but for the ragged breathing of 5 exhausted people and the distant nervous stamping of horses, Sarah sank to her knees in the scorched grass, her hands blistered, her dress smeared black with soot, and found Amos crouching beside her in the same instant, his own hands gentle where they closed over hers to check the damage the fire had done. "You could have been killed," he said, low and rough, and there was something in his voice that told her plainly the words cost him more than the fire had. "So could you," she said. "So could all of us," over a piece of land Grissom had no honest right to touch in the first place. Grissom, dismounted now and considerably paler than he'd been an hour before, found his voice at last. "This changes nothing about the water rights." "It changes everything," Amos said, rising and turning on him with a fury he'd kept banked all summer finally loosed. "Your greed nearly killed 5 people tonight, Grissom, mine and my own hired men both. I'll be filing a complaint with the county first thing come morning, not just on the water rights, which I'll fight you on till the ground itself runs dry, but on the reckless endangerment your dynamite and your scheming caused out here tonight. with witnesses enough to make the charge stick. 2 of your own men will testify to it, I'd wager, given they just risked their necks putting out a fire your greed set. He glanced at the 2 hired hands who would not meet Grissom's eyes, confirmation enough of where their loyalty now stood. You've bled this basin dry for 2 years, buying up desperate men's land at the bottom of their luck. That ends tonight. Grissom looked between the ruined channel, his own retreating men and the small, soot-streaked, unbroken woman kneeling in the burned grass at Amos Teller's side, and seemed to understand all at once that whatever leverage he'd believed he held had gone up with the fire. He mounted his horse without another word and rode back toward his own land, and though the legal fight that followed took the better part of 2 months to settle, the county surveyor's records proved exactly what Amos had claimed, and Grissom paid a heavy fine for the endangerment besides. Chastened enough by the near disaster and the damaged standing it cost him in the basin that he troubled the Teller place no further after. But that reckoning was still weeks away on the night the fire was finally out, and Sarah, sitting in the scorched grass with her blistered hands cradled in Amos's careful ones, found she cared considerably less about Grissom's fate than about the man crouched in front of her. His face soot-streaked and his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with dynamite or water rights at all. I told you this wasn't your fight to carry, he said quietly, and I told you it became mine the day you said I'd stay, Sarah said. I meant it then. I mean it more now, Sarah. Her name in his mouth was rough with something he'd clearly been holding back for weeks, maybe longer. I've spent 6 years telling myself I preferred my own company to anyone else's, because it hurt less that way, losing nothing you never let yourself want in the first place. Then you walked 12 miles through dust to my gate and asked for nothing but work, and I found myself wanting, for the first time since my folks died, a whole lot more than I'd let myself want in years. I don't know how to court a woman proper, not after all this time alone. But I know I don't want you living under my roof as hired help any longer. I want you there as my wife, if you'll have a man who's more comfortable talking to cattle than to people most days. Sarah felt the tears come at last, the ones she'd held through Daniel's funeral, through the bank's notice on her door, through 12 miles of dust and a summer of Mrs. Petty's whispers, and this time she let them fall freely, because there was nothing left to guard against and no one left to prove herself to. I've been in love with you since the night you told me the town could say whatever it liked to your face, she said. I just didn't think a lonely rancher of few words wanted to hear it said out loud. I want to hear it, Amos said. I want to hear it every day for the rest of my life, if you'll let me. Then yes, Sarah said. Yes, Amos Teller, I'll marry you. He kissed her there in the scorched grass, gentle despite the soot and the blisters and the exhaustion in both of them, while Jubal Hicks tactfully studied the horizon and pretended not to notice, and somewhere behind them the last curl of smoke from the beaten-back fire drifted up into a wide, patient sky that finally, that very night, after a whole summer of empty promises, began at last to spit the first fat. Blessed drops of long-awaited rain. They married that October, once the drought had broken proper and Cottonwood Creek ran full and silver again along its rightful course, in a small ceremony in the Teller ranch yard with Jubal standing witness and even Mrs. Petty. Considerably humbled by the whole county's knowledge of what truly transpired the night of the fire, offering a stiff but genuine blessing at the gate, the 2 downstream families Amos had shared his water with through the worst of the drought came bearing what small gifts they could spare. A quilt stitched by candlelight, a jar of preserves put up from the season's first good harvest, a hand-carved box for keeping letters, grateful neighbors turned fast friends, and the ranch that had stood empty and echoing for 6 lonely years filled at last with the noise and warmth of people who had chosen, deliberately and hard-won, to build a life together rather than endure one alone. Jubal stayed on that fall as full-time foreman, glad of steady work on a ranch he'd once helped Amos's own father run, and within a year 2 more hands had joined him, drawn by word that the Teller place had become, under its new mistress's care, one of the better outfits in the basin to work for. Sarah oversaw the kitchen accounts same as she'd once kept her own father-in-law honest in the county office, and more than one hand remarked, admiringly and without much surprise anymore, that Mrs. Teller could talk circles around any banker in Dry Mesa when the occasion called for it. Sarah kept a garden that following spring in the soil nearest the creek, the first thing she'd planted with her own hands since Daniel's death, and Amos, who had once told his sister he preferred cattle to company, found himself instead spending his evenings on the porch beside his wife, watching the water run steady past land that was, at long last, unambiguously and entirely theirs. When their first child was born the following winter, a daughter with her mother's steady chin and her father's watchful quiet, Amos held her in the same rough, careful hands that had once beaten out a prairie fire to save a stolen creek, and told Sarah, low and certain, that he had built this ranch twice in his life, once out of grief and stubbornness after his parents died, and once out of love, the second time round, with a woman who had walked 12 miles through dust and never once asked him for anything but the chance to prove herself worth keeping. "You were worth keeping the moment you walked through that gate," he told her, brushing a hand gentle over their daughter's dark hair. "I just needed a whole summer and a fire to say so properly. I've thought on it often since, how close I came to letting a proud silence cost me the best thing that ever walked 12 miles of dust to find me." "You said it plainly enough," Sarah answered, settling their daughter against her shoulder and leaning into the steady warmth of him, the creek running full and silver just beyond the porch rail, the whole ranch quiet and green and entirely, finally home. "You told me I'd stay. I've never once regretted taking you at your word, and I never will."